night on Valentine's Day. On Valentine's Day, no less. And I just want to thank you for coming. And I'm going to share my screen now. Uh, Hopefully that works out. All right. Hopefully everybody can see these images. And so my talk tonight is about Black women and the civil rights movement in New Jersey. And it's broken up into three sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about historiography for the first section of this conversation, for about 20, 30 minutes. The personal as political will be the second piece. And the last piece, I get into some of these individual case studies of women who were active in the civil rights movement in New Jersey. With historiography is the history of history. And it's essentially what historians have said about the past and the different arguments that they have made, the evidence that they have organized and interpreted and written into textbooks and books. Most of you are aware now that we're having big debates about history right now, and particularly African American history. There is a big conversation about African American AP history and whether or not it should be entered into the high schools. So we're in this moment right now that everybody is having this big conversation, not only about US history, but about African American history. And as it is African American History Month, I think I always tell my students that American history is African American history. It's not possible to discuss the major events of American history without discussing the history of African Americans, the Revolutionary War, for instance, and the Civil Rights Movement. So when you think of the big events in American history, from the Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil War, none of these conversations can be had without a discussion of African Americans. And so the history of history, historiography, is really historians debating what they have said about the past. And it's a part of historical studies, historiography, the history of history. So I start here with a conversation about what have historians said about the civil rights movement, and what are some of the books that historians have written about the civil rights movement. All of you have some knowledge of the civil rights movement. You learned about it maybe in grade school, high school, college, and we all have some knowledge of some of the key players of the civil rights movement. For instance, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King. We can probably name, a short list of people who were active in the civil rights movement, and it's based on what historians have already said about this event. So let's look at some of these books and talk about the history of history. So what have historians said about the civil rights movement? One major claim they make about the civil rights movement is that the struggle for Black equality is a concept that historian by the name of Harvard Sitkoff, in the image on the left, he wrote a book called The Struggle for Black Equality in 1981. And this phrase, the struggle for Black equality, was then picked up by other historians like Charles Payne and I've Got the Light of Freedom, book written in 1995. And these two historians essentially agree that there was a struggle for Black equality that was taking place before Brown versus Board of Education, before 1954. Or in other words, African Americans have always struggled for equality from the founding of the nation down to the present. And they've struggled for equality in different ways. They used the court. Sometimes they went into the court to petition for their freedom. Sometimes, and this was as early as the 1600s, the famous case of Elizabeth Key, who goes to court to sue for her freedom. In the 18th century, during the Revolutionary era, Elizabeth Freeman goes to court to sue for her freedom. So one way to struggle for equality was to go into the courtroom and say, I demand my freedom. And so these historians writing about the civil rights movement came to realize that there's a long history of struggle, and Sitkoff uses the phrase, the struggle for Black equality, to not only talk about the civil rights movement, but the longer history of African Americans. So this is a phrase that is picked up by historians to also talk about what was happening in Mississippi in 1950, what was happening in Alabama and New Jersey as well. So these are two books in which this phrase gets used. Charles Payne is looking particularly at Mississippi and individuals like Fannie Lou Hamer and Medgar Evers. The subtitle of his book is The Organizing Tradition and the Mississippi Freedom Struggle. And he adds to Hartford Sitkoff's argument about the struggle for Black equality existing before 1954 by coming up with this phrase, the organizing tradition. In other words, African Americans have a long tradition of organizing in their struggle for freedom, creating organizations like the Free African Society and the AME Church in the 1700s, the Congress of Racial Equality in 1940s, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, and before that, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. So there is a history of Black people struggling, demanding their freedom in different ways, through the courtroom, boycotts, marches, and creating associations like the NAACP in 1909 and the National Urban League, or NUL, in 1911. So there's this long history, there is this continuum of African Americans demanding their freedom in different ways over several centuries. So some of the first books about the civil rights movement obviously are about the South and about men like Martin Luther King and James Farmer. The first earliest books were written by people who were participating in the civil rights movement, and they were writing in the 1980s and the 1990s, mostly men who had been writing at this time. Of course, there were also women writing about their experiences, and books about women become more prominent in the late 80s, early 1990s. And Fannie Lou Hamer, for instance, comes up in the Charles Payne book that's written in 1995. And once it is revealed that she plays a major role in the Mississippi movement, we know about Medgar Evers. There's books about him. There's books about the Mississippi movement, mainly about men who were active. But Chanakai Lee's book, For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer, is really the first major book about one of the prominent women in the civil rights movement. It's in the mid 90s, if I recall, that Rosa Parks is also writing she writes an autobiography and of her activism. So in the late 80s, early 90s, you were starting to get books written by women, either autobiographies, and there are some that are written also earlier, women who were active in the sit-down movement in the 60s, and also the lunch counter sit-down movement, and also in the Mississippi movement. Anne Moody, for instance, is writing her autobiography very early, several decades before this book comes out. And but Fannie Lou Hamer was a working class woman who was very active in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which she helps to create, working along students who came into Mississippi during Freedom Summer in 1964. So For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer is one of these earlier books about women in the civil rights movement. By the early 2000s, Ella Baker, there's then a book about her. Ella Baker was the first executive director of the student of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was Martin Luther King's organization, that many historians by the late 90s had come to realize that Ella Baker was really the organizer behind SCLC, and that Rosa Parks was active in the civil rights movement long before Martin Luther King came on the scene in Montgomery, Alabama. In fact, several women were active in the civil rights movement before Martin Luther King even arrived in the state of Alabama, in Montgomery. Remember, Martin Luther King is from Georgia. And, after he marries Coretta, they go into the state of Montgomery and settle, and he gets active in the NAACP and other organizations that come to create the civil rights movement in the South. So a few things that we know about the civil rights movement. There were men involved, there were women involved who were attached to the Black church. There were different organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League, National Association of Colored Women, NACW. There were these groups and organizations that were created several decades before Montgomery bus boycott in '55. But what historians have come to realize is that women also played a prominent role in the civil rights movement. And in fact, it's in the late 90s and early 2000s that many historians are making the argument that the civil rights movement was a women's movement. It was a women's movement in Mississippi, it was a women's movement in Atlanta, and it was a women's movement in New Jersey. A significant book comes out in 2010 called At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power by Danielle L. McGuire. And I recommend this book. It's a tough book in that it takes on a very difficult subject matter, and that is the assault of women. So the historians that are starting to make this argument that the civil rights movement was a woman's movement by the late 1990s, early 2000s, are looking at some of these prominent women like Fannie Lou Hamer and Danielle McGuire's book, looking at Rosa Parks. And what Danielle McGuire comes to find out is that Rosa Parks was one of the greatest investigators that was with the NAACP, and that she was active very early in Alabama because she sent to investigate the assault of Black women. And it's in the 1940s that she's down there investigating these attacks on Black women. And the famous case of Reese Taylor, who's assaulted by a group of white men and then takes her case to the NAACP. The NAACP, before it would take a case, would send its lawyers and its investigators down to see what in fact had happened. And so Rosa Parks was one of the earliest women who was involved in these investigations of the assault of Black women like Reese Taylor. So Danielle McGuire starts to dig down deeply into this story and found out that not only was Rosa Parks a bold investigator, she wasn't a tired old grandmother, right? That she was an activist as early as the 1940s and came from a militant family. a family that advocated fighting back, and that there were different ways to fight back, like to go into the courtrooms and but also to take to the streets and boycott and demonstrate. Rosa Parks' family members who were a part of the Garvey movement. So Rosa Parks has this long history of being an activist, and that the women who were helping Rosa Parks to investigate had created something called the Montgomery, the Women's Political Council. And this was in the same place that Montgomery bus boycott began. And what Danielle McGuire's argument is that at this time, Martin Luther King is a young man in grade school. He's just coming out of grade school at the time in the 1940s, right? He's like 14 years old at this time, and he's nowhere on the scene because this is happening not in his home state. It's happening in Alabama, where these women are organizing at the grassroots level, and they're creating what was called the Women's Political Council. And they are agitating and trying to, push back against segregation in the city and these attacks on women that Rosa Parks came to investigate. So why I'm talking about these books and how it links up with our conversation about Black women in New Jersey is the fact that my point is that historians have been making arguments about the civil rights movement and writing about the civil rights movement in the South, right? It began with the South. It began in places like Alabama and Georgia, and it began with men. My argument is that this actually changes at around the late 90s, early 2000s, when historians of women's history are actually saying, wait a minute, it's these women who are organizing at the grassroots level and laying the foundation of much of the civil rights movement before we get to some of these more prominent men that we recognize, like Martin Luther King. These historians are not saying that the men didn't do what they did, but they are saying that we've forgotten that women laid much of the groundwork for the Montgomery bus boycott. And you had to convince these women to stay off the buses. These women who were going onto the bus and working in homes as domestic servants. You had to figure out how to get 40,000 people, many of whom were women, to stay off those buses in order for the bus boycott to work and be successful. And so who was organizing at the ground level? It was the women of the Women's Political Council. And so we find that these books that are written about the civil rights movement take a development and begin to focus on the role of women. McGuire's book is important to understand that the civil rights movement is a women's movement, and that's what I argue, along with these other historians. It had to be a women's movement. And at the opening part of her book, if you get a chance to read this book, read the preface. It's just a few lines in which she says that because these women were being attacked and assaulted, they had a vested interest in starting a civil rights movement because their bodily harm was coming to them in these homes where they would be attacked, and they could not petition and go to court because it could have meant that harm would have came to them. And so the fact that these women have a vested interest these women have a vested interest in getting involved in the civil rights movement because they have to, right? It's a matter of their bodily integrity. So it has to be a women's movement in the South, and I say also in the North. Now, African Americans in the history of New Jersey is where we take our turn now, and there have been many books written about African Americans in the history of New Jersey. Walter D. Grayson, Suburban Erasure: How the Suburbs Ended the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey. Because about 2 decades ago, historians began to say that not only was there a civil rights movement in the South, there also was one in the North, in places like New Jersey. And so Dr. Grayson has 2 chapters in his book that really talk about the roots of the civil rights movement in New Jersey. And then, of course, Betty Livingston Adams, Black women's Christian activism, seeking social justice in a northern suburb, is about Black women in northern New Jersey who are also laying the foundations of the civil rights movement. So scholars then begin, and by the 2000s, they start to talk about the civil rights movement in the North and in states like New Jersey. And before we, take a few minutes, I want to start the second piece, the personal is political, the Albany movement in 1961. Right, there is a man in this photo. I don't know how many of you can actually see this, but this is Albany, Georgia, and this is a man by the name of Sam Wells here, who was one of the leaders of the Albany movement. And whereas the personal is political, and what drew me to want to write about the civil rights movement in the North and the South is the fact that my mother marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Albany, Georgia. And when she was 18 years old, at the time, she was about 18 years old, getting ready to graduate from high school, she got involved in the civil rights movement. And there were many, if you look at this image right here, right, you see many young women, and you could actually see my mom walking into the church in one of the archival images of the Albany movement. And just interviewing her and talking to her about the young women, high school students, grade school students, and of course, older women who were active in the civil rights movement. It was telling me a story that, women were involved in the civil rights movement, both in the North and the South. Sam Wells, I got a chance to interview him, and he was in his 80s at the time, and he subsequently passed away a few years ago. But I had a chance to interview him, and at 80 years old, he wept like a baby, telling me about the Albany movement. So this is in part a personal story, and the personal is political. Their personal dignity was on the line for these women. The civil rights movement had to be a women's movement because their personal dignity and everyday integrity was being impugned at such a level that these women were willing to stop riding that bus in Montgomery, but also take on the challenge to start this movement and make it a mass movement. And we start to see the roots of it in New Jersey, and particularly Black women who were associated with the church, just as the Black men were associated with the church, like Martin Luther King and James Farmer. Some of these women were church women who really laid the foundations of the early civil rights movement in North Jersey. Betty Adams' book is about Florence Marion Randolph, who's on the right here. And Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham has written about the Black women's movement in the church. Righteous Discontent is her book from 93, which is essentially the women's movement in the Black Baptist Church, 1880 to 1920, where these women had organizing skills, and those organizing skills came out of their church activism and their missionary work, like Florence Marion Randolph. So they are right there alongside the men and developing these skills as organizers. Because keeping 40,000 people off a bus or off buses is going to take some organizing skills. It's going to take the ladies auxiliary unit from the church, right? And so women are heavily involved in the civil rights movement, North and South, and also in New Jersey. So I think this might be a good place to pause because that's about 30 minutes in, I believe. And I'll kind of, I guess I could stop sharing for a second there and see where we are. I think we're 30 minutes in. So if we, on the first, let me just see. I'm trying to look. Someone asked about the books that I mentioned. I think at the end of the slide, I have some of those books mentioned, and I could certainly share those with you. That's certainly possible. And then there's another question about Malcolm X. I think he is heavily influenced by his sister, but I think also his mother.
Oh.
There's a book called Three Mothers, and I'll type that in there. And it's a book about the mother of James Baldwin's mother. It talks about Malcolm X's mother and Martin Luther King's mother. And it's really making that argument that I said that a lot of historians are making, that the civil rights movement, that these three males are heavily influenced by their mothers. Their mothers were the activists and the ones that were, pushing back, and that their mothers, passed that legacy down to them. And so
You
really good.
don't hear much of that in the autobiography of Malcolm X. It doesn't really give much credit to the mother and the sister. I mean, I was really surprised when I read Maribel's book, which I had little problems with too, but he talks about his, Malcolm, following his sister, Betty, was it? I'm not sure, but I was surprised, frankly, by that, having only read the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you make. And really, I think the book Three Mothers is something nobody has really done, to look at these women, because we focus on the men so much and what they accomplished. We don't say too much about their mothers or their siblings or even their wives. There are books now that also, like Coretta Scott King was every much the activist that Martin Luther King was. In fact, they had a partnership. There's a recent book about that. And if you follow their daughter, Bernice King, on Twitter, she's always elevating her mother, and she says, "Don't forget my mom. My parents were partners in this." And she was every month the activist, and she continued the activism when he was after he was assassinated.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's been interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I just want to give everybody else a chance if they had a question about some of the books I mentioned. I was probably going through a little bit of that, but I could recap in that my points are that our first books about the civil rights movement really tell us this is a movement led by men, and it happened in the South. And it happened first at Montgomery, and prior to that was Brown versus Board of Education. And that's where it all begins in the 1950s. But historians are really saying that it begins long before that. It happens in the North as well. And it's not only the men. In fact, the shift has turned towards the activism of women and their central role in the civil rights movement. A lot of what we do is we tend to have a dichotomous frame. We have Rosa Parks as the mother, and we have Martin Luther King as the father. So we look at the two of them through a dichotomous framework, and we kind of say, okay, here's the mother and the father of the movement. And we don't really look at Martin Luther King as a radical, although he was a radical thinker. And if you situate him in the context in which he lived, people, you could look at the newspapers and what people are saying when he is planning a march in their town. And they're saying, get this troublemaker out of here. We don't want him. He's going to cause trouble. Why are you, doing this? And so on and so forth. So uh, those are some of the lessons we are first learning about the civil rights movement. But more recent work is telling us actually that it was a much more expansive movement beyond the South and involving women. So let's go back to where we stopped here and look at these slides again. So, so some of the women that I wanted to just highlight or profile here, I'm sure, if you come from New Jersey, grew up in New Jersey, you probably learned about yourself. And Sarah Spencer Washington is one of them. She gets overshadowed by Madam C.J. Walker a lot. We often learn about C.J. Walker, and we don't learn too much about Sarah Spencer Washington, but she also becomes a millionaire through the hair care and beauty business. And she used her wealth and her money to help desegregate the boardwalk in Atlantic City. A lot of people look at her, sometimes argue that she was a more conservative figure than some of the other activists in New Jersey that I'll talk about. But she creates a beauty empire around the Apex Beauty. There's now, I think her great grandson has put out a documentary about her. And I know there's at least one short book about her life too. But she builds this beauty empire, and it was a global business. She had operations in South Africa and different parts of the world, the West Indies, and she was employing like 45,000 people around the globe, and one of the earliest women to own and operate a factory. She was active in several civil rights organizations, including NACW, National Association of Colored Women. But she was also active in the NAACP and Black Republican clubs at the time. So she was politically active. She was also involved in giving her money to charity, starting a rest home, and noted for the integration of the beaches. And when African Americans were not allowed to come onto the beach at certain times, she bought a part of the beach and had a parade of her own, a beauty parade that included Black women because they were barred from participating in the pageants at the time. So she started her own. She's a very savvy businesswoman, but recognized that the struggle for Black equality was something important and something that she wanted to get directly involved in. So she does. There's also Annie Malone, and there's also Louise Scott in Northern New Jersey. We hear a lot about Madam C.J. Walker, who also gave her money to philanthropic causes and civil rights causes. But there's actually several Black women who make their money into the millions. And before C.J. Walker, there's also Annie Malone, who makes the first million really before C.J. Walker. And she had developed the system, and C.J. Walker worked for her, right? And then breaks away and creates her own business. So you had like competing businesses. The major one was Apex and the Poro system under Annie Malone, and then the Walker system. And then later you get Louise Scott in Northern New Jersey and Newark. So there are several women. And the beauty shop was also, Tiffany Gill writes about the Black Beauty Shop as a place to socialize and organize. It was another organizing ground for African American women in particular, right? It was a place to organize and strategize uh, as a part of the struggle for Black equality. So these are just this is from the Atlantic City collection of Sarah Spencer Washington section in the Atlantic City Library. So she had offices in Newark, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Chicago, Washington, Baltimore, Atlantic City. She had a publishing co. She wrote her own copy in these books, laboratories, and so she becomes very well known, and she's written up in the Black newspapers for the Apex Beauty School. And she's also, if you read her pamphlet, she's talking about women's empowerment. She's saying you don't have to rely on a man to take care of you. You can learn a trade, you can learn a profession, and then you can set up your own business and take care of yourself. So that's one of the women I profile, and I do see her as laying the groundwork in part in South Jersey. The civil rights movement takes off in South Jersey as well as North Jersey with somebody like we mentioned Randolph, right? Lawrence Spring Randolph is in Summit, New Jersey, in the north, and we have a question. Is the same question, Chad? Yes.
Hi, Mary.
Mhm.
So was there something unique, you think, about New Jersey that contributed? What were the factors you think that helped?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what I argue is that there's a uniquely positioned Black middle class because New Jersey has one of the largest, during the colonial era, New Jersey has one of the largest Black populations. It rivals, Philadelphia and New York. And at one point in the colonial era, it has, one of the largest Black populations in the north. And so you had like a long-standing Black community that had already built churches, one of in schools and kind of an infrastructure. There's also one of a significant case that I will talk about in a minute that also happens in New Jersey 10 years before it happens in the Brown case. And that's a part of what, it's another factor. You had these middle class professionals who were laying the groundwork, and also these women who were working, working class women who are a part of the Apex Beauty schools, as well as I put Spencer as a part of this. So this is just an image from 1976. Again, these are from the Sarah Spencer Washington collection at the Atlantic City Free Public Library. If you're ever down there in Atlantic City, you stop off at the Atlantic City Public Library, you can ask to see the Sarah Spencer Washington collection. It's really a great collection at the local library, with all of these images of her. Here she is right here. One of her, according to her great grandson, one of her famous statements was, "Now is the time to plan for your future." And you would see it in her pamphlets and the things that she wrote down, and always kind of reminding women that they can, be self-empowered. So they have some great images down there. The next individual I would like to talk about is not born in New Jersey and doesn't settle in New Jersey for very long, but she is active in New Jersey through the YWCA for a couple of years. And it's very hard for her to get a professional job with a college degree in the 1920s. She's born in Anoka, Minnesota. She travels south. She doesn't really care for what's happening in the South. She gets, angered at how African Americans are being treated. She returns home and tries to search for a job and is unable to find one, and eventually does find a job with the YWCA and is dispatched to Jersey City, New Jersey, where she's trying to organize, laundry workers, women laundry workers. And she gets involved in the early trade union movement, but she's also involved in the National Council of Churches, the NAACP, and the Fair Employment Practices Committee, and the first March on Washington, which is formed in the 1940s during World War II, where she links up with A. Philip Randolph, who's a major trade unionist. She's a co-founder of the National Organization of Women, and I call her a pluralist interracialist, which is a lot of, it's kind of a big phrase I use, because she was active in so many different organizations and moving in and out of organizations. At one point, she said that she was a Black nationalist and she no longer wanted to talk to white people anymore because of the discrimination she was experiencing and seeing. But she never stops believing in the idea of interracial cooperation, even though she declared herself to be a nationalist. And what I say is that people have different memberships in all of these different organizations. There were people who were in the Garvey movement, but they were also in the NAACP at the same time. Because the struggle for Black equalities was so multidimensional that you couldn't really afford to say, well, I'm only going to organize with this one organization, right? You sort of were moving in and out and in between. So that's why I say, she's kind of straddling the fence across these different organizations. But when she's in Jersey City, New Jersey in the late 1920s, she tries to organize these laundry women. Now, she's from a middle-class background herself, but she disguises herself as one of the laundry women to try to get some information on how she might be able to help organize them. She's ultimately not very successful while she's in New Jersey, but she makes some significant labor union contacts in the state of New Jersey, so that when she relocates to the Harlem YWCA in New York, she becomes well known as an organizer, which led her to become the only woman on the committee to organize the March on Washington in 1963. Prior to that, she was the executive director of the Federal Employment Practices Committee to look into discrimination in employment. It subsequently led the state of New Jersey and New York, because she's active in both states, to agree to stop discrimination in the workplace 20 years before the federal government does. So that's why, right, she is a central figure in the civil rights movement, because one of the major things that Martin Luther King is arguing for the nation is equal access to public spaces and employment. And she accomplishes it by working with trade unionists in New Jersey and New York. And New Jersey and New York are the first states to sign an FEPC law. There's one book about her, and Until There's Justice. This book that just came out a couple of years ago. There's only one book about her, believe it or not. Little known fact. Marion Thompson Wright is from New Jersey, and she's from Montclair, actually. She's from northern New Jersey. And she plays a pivotal role in the civil rights movement in New Jersey. And she does this as a social scientist and historian. She's the first Black woman to earn a PhD from an American university, from Columbia's Teachers College, in the field of history. She takes her knowledge of school segregation and she writes about it in her dissertation that is then published by Columbia University in 1940. And so she amasses this historical research about segregation. She's active in the NAACP, and the NAACP makes themselves aware of her research. Her research then gets used in one of the more significant cases in the nation. And it's the only precedent-setting case in the nation before Brown versus Board involving Black children. And it's the famous case of Hedgepeth Williams versus the Trenton Board of Education in 1944. It's the only case in the country involving Black kids and the desegregation of schools. In the middle, you have Robert Queen, who is an NAACP lawyer, takes the case of Gladys Hedgepeth and Berlene Williams and their children. Their children are told that they're not allowed to attend one middle school because they were Black. One middle school was reserved for whites in Trenton and the other was reserved for Blacks. They argued that the school that was closest to us was reserved for white students. They go to the NAACP and they say, you know, take our case. Marion Thompson Wright has done the work to prove that segregation was still happening, even though there was a law against it in the state. And so the New Jersey Supreme Court hands down a ruling that this is in fact segregation and it must stop immediately in the school system. This is 10 years before Brown versus Board of Education, and it's why the civil rights movement began in New Jersey. Several other cases began to take place. The Scottsboro case of the North, and brings major organizations into the state, like the NAACP again. In the NAACP records, they state that we're going to focus on certain states to try and advance the struggle for Black equality, and New Jersey is a special case. They literally say that in their memos. And at the time when many of these cases were happening, Walter White is executive director, and James Weldon Johnson are actually saying that what's happening in New Jersey is so important that it's one of our special test cases, states where we can test, you know, what is happening in regards to, you know, segregation in the schools and in employment. As a result, unlike New York, New Jersey changes its constitution 3 years later. And you can't see this point here, but you could always look up New Jersey State Constitution of 1947. And the 5th point here, no person shall be denied the enjoyment of any civil or military right, nor discriminated against in the exercise of any civil or military right, nor be segregated in the militia or in the public schools because of religious principles, race, color, ancestry, or national origin. That's 20 years before the federal government does this. Similar things are happening in northern states like New York. New York gets a series of amendments to its constitution, but it doesn't change its constitution as New Jersey does. And New Jersey does this because of the activism of women like Gladys Hedgepeth and Berlene Williams, using the historical research for litigation that gets used in Brown versus Board. Where does that historical research come from? It comes from Marion Thompson Wright's work on the segregation of schools in New Jersey that was first used in this case. Marion Thompson Wright gets invited to work on the Brown case, and they use her research that was applied here in the case of Hedgepeth versus Williams. And it's the precedent-setting case in the nation through 54. As a result, there are a series of civil rights laws that come into place in New Jersey, ending discrimination in public places and in the National Guard and in the New Jersey State Militia in 1949. And this is just the signing Governor Driscoll civil rights bill called a milestone in democracy. So you get something similar like this in the federal level in 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's almost word for word. It says no discrimination in public places will be allowed, right? And that's what people in the South or in the streets demanding, right? Let me see. And Black women in the struggle for equality at the present, and I argue that Black, women have always been there at the forefront, at the grassroots level, organizing and collecting data and research and applying their data and research and skills. And you kind of see it today with Latasha Brown and Stacey Abrams, with things like the New Georgia Project, Fair Fight, and Black Voters Matter. This is Fannie Lou Hamer, right, in the 60s, right? Concerned about registering people to vote. We're almost back to some of the same strategies. And there's some of you asked about the different sources I use, and I could share this. It's no problem. The Atlantic City Public Library, Sarah Spencer Washington Collection in Atlantic City. The New Jersey State Archives, the Urban Color Population Commission papers. The Moreland Spingarn Center at Howard University has photographs of these women. New Jersey Historical Society, Florence Spearing Randolph. Yale University has the Lester Granger papers. And of course, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, as well as the Montclair Public Library has a collection on the YWCA. The image in the first slide has a very great collection that talks about Black women in New Jersey. I think I'm about time. I probably have a few more minutes. Let me just stop this. I know there's maybe questions in the chat. I just have some. Oh, the name of the case in New Jersey, Hedgepeth Williams versus the Trenton Board of Education. 1944. Somebody has a question about Sarah Washington. How was she allowed to become a success? Well, I would say African Americans became there are cases of African Americans as successful despite what they faced. And that's why I invite everybody to go down to Atlantic City Public Library and read some of her pamphlets. I mean, her pamphlets are very audacious. She's saying, take control of your own destiny, work for yourself, don't work for anyone else. You can do this. There's a tradition of self-help in the African-American tradition. Goes back to the creation of the Free African Society in the late 18th century, which eventually becomes the AME Church, which has been called the Liberation Church. The AME Church, that's why I said the struggle of Black equality doesn't start in 54, right? Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, right, when they're thrown out of a church trying to pray, say, you know what, we're going to go start our own church. So I would say that, right, Marion Thompson Wright, there's a lecture in her honor, right? Well deserved. So that's my answer to that, right? That African Americans survived and strived in spite of what they faced. And that's what we call the self-help tradition, right? And kind of this larger struggle for Black equality is a part of people creating their own organizations, associations, and schools, and figuring out a way to survive in the face of horror. I think I answered everybody's questions. Hopefully I did. Okay. Well, thank you. I don't know if anybody has more questions or thoughts.
Anyone else has questions can unmute themselves. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute themselves. They can do that now.
Well, question about her being allowed to be successful. It just seems so crazy that they actually let a woman be that successful, a black woman. I still cannot believe that it's a 40s because, as I said, they burned down the Black Wall Street of the bankers.
Mm.
And how come she was able to just go on and
Yeah, I think she was tenacious. She was also a savvy businesswoman. She's in a world in which she's really inventing some new techniques in American advertising. And the thing about it, you mentioned the case of Black Wall Street. I mean, Black people were working, they had money, and they wanted to look good. So they were purchasing her product. She wasn't the first, though. It's Annie Malone who came before her, who became a millionaire and had these schools. And CJ Walker is working for Malone and creates her own school too. And she's really like the third one with Apex. The Apex system was like one of the third major systems, and then you get Louise Scott in Newark, New Jersey, who's doing something similar. They're training each other how to this technique.
well,
So
that's obviously South Africa, considering that they had their own apartheid system there, and to have a black woman come and start making money over there sounds so incredible.
yeah, I think it's incredible. I think you're absolutely right, because with what they had to face, I mean, when they told her you can't, go on the, Black people can't go on the beach, she said, all right, I'll buy that house. And she bought this house right on the boardwalk because she said, I'll segregate. You won't segregate it by law. I'll segregate it with my money. I'll desegregate it with my money. And that's what she did. She bought like the most prominent house in the area. So I think like the struggle for Black equality is like something that's ongoing, but we don't talk enough. Maybe we do, but I think we just don't talk enough about people who strive and survive in spite of their circumstances, in the face of horror, right? They find a way to overcome and survive. And it gets passed down, right? The struggle is it's never ending. It gets passed down to the next generation. There's a song that the civil rights activists sung, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." And so the struggle gets passed down. Bernice Johnson Reagan, who was a member of SNCC, there was actually a choir, right? The SNCC singers, they would sing, and then pass messages to one another for inspiration. And that was one of the songs that they sung. So, but that's what we have to remind ourselves about too, that these are people who never give up. It's everywhere, and the story of Black Americans is the American story of striving for freedom. And it's African Americans who continuously call this nation the conscience again and again, and make it more democratic in the process for everybody, right? For everybody. Trying to make sure I got everybody's questions. So yeah, there's a lot of great books out there. There's Eyes on the Prize. If anybody's like video, if you haven't seen Eyes on the Prize before, that's a great video series I could recommend. There is Clint Smith. I'm going to put his name in here. Maurice might not like me for this. This is Clint Smith has done like a series on African American history, and it's on YouTube. And I think the entire thing's free and accessible. He does the entire history of African American video series. If you go to YouTube and type in Clint Smith, African American history, And I think they're not, I mean, they're like short snippets of history, but it's a good kind of it's a very good, I think, tool, learning tool.
Yeah, this is great, Dr. Lewis. I mean, we can also compile a list and send it out to students after the class. It's great information. I like all these resources, videos and books. That's fine. We could definitely, I'd love to share this list with all the students.
Oh, sure. No, I can, you can, I'll give you these slides if you want.
All right, great. Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you. Great.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and if everybody wants to look at that list of books that I use, they're right on the slides. That's perfectly fine with me. And hopefully I answered everybody's question.
It would actually be great to read up on the three women that you
Yeah, the
Oh,
Dark End of the Street, it's a tough book. I want to warn everybody, trigger warning for that book. You know, she is talking about the sexual assault of Black women, and she's saying they rose up because it had gotten to the point where the assaults were so frequent, and in the workplace, in the home, on the streets, and she's tying that to why, you know, the civil rights movement has to be understood as a Black women's movement. And but it's like it's a life-changing book, but it is a tough book to read. I have to be honest with you on that. It really gets you to think about it gets you to think about women and how women must reclaim the night, not just Black women, but women, and why white women were willing to lay down their lives alongside these women, like Viola Luzo, who sees what's happening on the street, is an Italian woman and says, "I'm going down there. I'm going to help these kids." And so she's taking a young man home from a young. So she's a white woman riding in the car in the South with a Black student, college student who's coming back from a march, and she gets her head blown off and she lays down her life. But women realize that, and there are white women who are driving, right? You could say, hey, they just want their maids to come to work, but it was still dangerous for a white woman to do that. To go and say, because that is seen as being in collusion with the movement. So there are times in which in the South and the North, Black and white women came together and realized that this has to be a women's movement for bodily integrity, for safety, for taking back the night. Oh, is there, I missed a question? Just want to make sure. All right. All right. Okay, somebody said they read it. Yeah, it's a tough book, everybody. I would read, you know, even if the preface section, she lays out her argument in the preface, which is a few pages, but you know, it lets you know what's coming, and you probably need to read it in doses just because it's pretty heavy. Or you could, I know Danielle McGuire, she does several book. There's a couple of book talks that she does on YouTube as well, where you could get the sense of the book. But it's one of those game changing books that, you know, what historians were saying, hey, this is a woman's movement, but her book really says, here's why.
Okay, everyone, I don't know if there's any more questions. We can please unmute yourself and say them and ask them now. If not, we're going to wrap things up. We have a variety of Black History Month programming still to come in this week and next. Please look for those. We'll be sending you guys a listing while you registered. We have a great Open Book, Open Mind event coming on the 25th. The author of My Name is George Floyd, he'll be in conversation here on Saturday because of February 25th. So please mark that in your calendars. We'll also have some classes coming about ancient Nubia, as well as some classes about anti-Black art, so the antebellum era that's coming up soon as well. So keep those in your calendar. We'll be sending you notices. And thank you all for coming out tonight. If there are no other questions, we can wrap things up. Dr. Williams will be sending a list of her recommended readings and resources that we'll share with you guys, as well as her PowerPoint presentation. This was a great talk. Thank you, Dr. Williams. And
Thank you.
thank everyone else for coming out. Have a wonderful evening, all. Enjoy your Valentine's Day.
Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.